Good morning,
Okay.
everyone. Dr. Arif Hargono, Dr. Coordinator Studi Program of Master Disaster Management Postgraduate School, University of Erlangga, and Professor Dr. Ifteh Ahmed, Associate Professor, Construction Management Disaster Resilience from the University of Newcastle, Australia. Dear participants, students, welcome. Today we have a very special agenda of public lecture by Associate Professor Ifteh Ahmed from the University of Newcastle, Australia. This public lecture is presented by Master of Disaster Management of the Postgraduate School, University of Erlangga. Before I invite Professor Ifteh Ahmed, I would like to read a short of curriculum CV of Professor Ifteh Ahmed. Dr. Ifteh Ahmed is Associate Professor, Construction Management, Disaster Resilience, School of Architecture and Built Environment, the University of Newcastle, Australia. And Professor Ifteh professional appointment was a project manager, an architect, and shelter specialist. Is that correct, Prof? Yes, and a few of his academic appointment from 2007 until 2009 is visiting academic University of Melbourne Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, Australia. And in 2009 till 2011 as a researcher fellow at RMIT University Climate Change Adaptation Program. And right now, he also is a guest professor at Postgraduate School of Universitas Erlangga, and you can see his CV from our website. So, Professor will give a lecture for about 45 minutes, and after that we continue with Q&A. And so, without further ado, I invite Professor Ifteh, and the time is yours, Prof.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. So I hope you can hear me clearly, and greetings to you all from Newcastle, the University of Newcastle. You can see our beautiful city behind me. It is not a real setting, but you can see that our seaside city is a beautiful city and our campus. So before I talk about what I'm going to do, I'll just tell you basically what I'm going to talk about. I will be talking about vulnerability in terms of disaster risk. And I'll focus mainly from a social and policy perspective on that one. So just to, and Dr. Fritri actually gave you an introduction about myself. So I won't go into great detail. This is just me, that I was born in Bangladesh originally. I'm trained as an architect, though I don't work directly in the architecture field, though I do a lot of work in the reconstruction area, and post-disaster housing reconstruction is my specialization. And I've studied in all over the world, Bangladesh, India, USA, UK, and I also started working at the University of Newcastle. As mentioned before, I used to work at RMIT University in Melbourne, but I started in the University of Newcastle in 2016. I worked at the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center. That's where I got my very extensive experience in the disaster risk reduction field, and also in the United Nations Development Program when I was a shelter specialist for a very large post-flood recovery program. And research and work experience all over the world, increasingly now in the Asia-Pacific region, in Pacific Island countries such as Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, and so on. So I won't go into the whole names, but basically a lot of engagement in the Asia-Pacific region. And so what I'll tell you is also just to show you a little bit of the work I do. These are some of the publications that I've been writing. This is a very recent one published last year, looking at disaster resilience in the 5 smaller South Asian countries: Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives. And again, so I won't go into each of them, just to show you a little flavor. And this is also, a lot of the work that I do is community based, and it focuses on vulnerable and marginal communities, particularly in the Asia Pacific region. So this book has case studies from 13 different countries around the world. We covered all 5 continents except for South America. So, and this one is also what I was mentioning to you, that my specialization is in the post-disaster housing reconstruction area. And so this is a book co-authored by me recently on that area. So today, just to give you a very little flavor of who I am, what I am, just to give you a personal touch to this online lecture. Unfortunately, we can't do these things face-to-face anymore. Otherwise, it would have been nicer to actually come and talk to you in the class. But in any case, so let's just continue. So the first part, I will be talking about the conceptual side of things: vulnerability, risk capacity, all that. And I'll categorize vulnerability. We'll do a little online exercise, if you're willing to do that, on categorization of vulnerability. And we'll compare, make different, and understand the differences and similarities. And in the second part, we'll talk a little bit about power and analyze power in terms of the disaster risk reduction and management. I tend to prefer the term DRRM, disaster risk reduction and management, because disaster management is outdated. If a disaster has happened, how can you manage it? Right, so you might have to manage the risk. And so looking at developed and developing countries, and also the different social, religious, cultural, behavioral factors that influence vulnerability, and how they relate to power relationships. And also look a little bit at provision of aid, particularly aid from so-called developed countries or countries of the global north to the global south. So before I go into it, I just want to give you a little definition of vulnerability. And vulnerability, some of the definitions I have followed the definition by the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR. And for you students who are studying disaster management at your university, you should look for terminology in the UNDRR terminology. If you just Google it, you can, if you want to know what is recovery, what is resilience, what is vulnerability, what is capacity, what is disaster risk, you can find all the definitions, and those definitions are internationally accepted. So that is what I'm following. And this particular slide, what I'm showing is that you can see the small boy, and he's obviously vulnerable. He's standing in a position, he's surrounded by swirling flood waters surround him, and he might at any moment just be swept away in that water. So basically it just shows it's a condition or a set of conditions. He could come from a poor background, so his poverty, his age, all that. He may not have any parents, so it's just a compound set of characteristics that makes people more vulnerable. And then they can't, the 3 sides to it. First, you prepare for a hazard, has its impact, to withstand it while the hazard is unfolding into a form of disaster, and then respond as well. So that is vulnerability. And what I will do is that I'll try to give you an overview of vulnerability in terms of its relationship with hazard and disaster. So what you see on the right-hand side is a diagram that shows that when the conditions of hazard meet vulnerability, you have a disaster. So you may have a hazard, but if people are not vulnerable, you won't have a disaster. Okay, or if the hazard is of very low magnitude, but you have a very high amount of vulnerability, then you'll have a disaster. And then the disaster affect the elements at risk, such as people, buildings, assets, all kinds of things. And so if you look at some of these, and I won't go into it, of course, you know this quite well, I'm sure, that the different kinds of hazards and the kind of elements that are risk according to those particular type of hazards, and what kind of vulnerable conditions make those hazards have those impact. I will show you a very quick video clip on vulnerability. Right, that was just a very short clip just to show the different conditions so that make vulnerability. But now we come to the word risk. So what is risk? We talk about disaster risk reduction much more than management, because if you reduce the risk, then you don't have to do so much of management. Okay, so basically risk is, again, it's a probability. And it's the community structure, geographical area, assets, all that, they can be damaged or affected by the impact of a particular hazard. So you're going back to your hazard, the definition of hazard, which I gave you before, because of how they are built, the kind of construction, the nature, the characteristics, where they're located, whether they're located in a hazardous area. And you can see this photograph that you can see these houses. The nature of construction is not very good. They are vulnerable. If there's a very strong wind, some of the roofing sheets will fly off. You see, they've tried to use these bamboo poles on top to keep the roofing sheets from flying off, for example. But also it's very close to water. But they also, human factors, you see the waste, the rubbish that is in the water. So it's also affecting their health. So the risk is, yes, it's from the natural hazards, but also human-induced, man-made hazards, which compound together into a situation of risk for people who live in conditions like this. So there's a common equation. You may have come across it in your classes. So risk is equal to hazard times vulnerability divided by capacity. Now, I didn't talk about capacity before. I was talking about vulnerability as a weakness, but capacity is a very important element. It offsets vulnerability. So risk is directly proportional to the hazard and vulnerability and inversely proportional to the capacity, which means that if you increase your capacity, your risk goes down. And if you reduce your vulnerability, your risk goes down. So for our practice, for DRRM professionals and practitioners, what they need to do is in order to reduce risk, we need to work on reducing vulnerability and building up capacity, increasing capacity of people. Okay, so now I come to the word capacity, and it is the positive conditions, positive abilities, capabilities, which help a community to deal with hazards. Okay, and you can see this photograph. One of our colleagues, she's also a firefighter. And this is a capacity in Australia. These are firefighters who are volunteers. So this is not from a government agency or anyone working for a government bureau. They are all volunteers, and they have the right equipment, the right tools, and they work together with the government authorities to be able to address issues. So this is the capacity within the community. Sorry, I'm just seeing your chat box in there. If there are any questions, I think we'll wait for the Q&A afterwards. Okay, so with that, that's your capacity. You see, so capacity offsets vulnerability. Capacity is the resource, knowledge, understanding, strength that lies within a community that can help them address their risk and their hazards. So you see, capacity is often not understood. Like you see this photograph of this woman. I took this photograph in Bangladesh, and look at the stuff she's making. It's beautiful. And it's a knowledge base that she has inherited from her previous generation. And this knowledge base she will transmit to the next generation. So when we go to societies like, poor countries, and we look at people like that, we say, oh, how vulnerable. She's old and she's poor. But within that vulnerability, there's also capacity. And we have to understand that. I think it's very interesting. One of my actually Indonesian former colleagues, he did a PhD at RMIT University when I was there. Now he works for the United Nations. His name is Muhibuddin bin Usama. And what he did was he did a study in the Philippines, and he found out that the capacity and vulnerability, they can coexist. They can be together. It is not only one supersedes the other, but people who ostensibly don't have any power or capacity on the surface, they look really weak and vulnerable. They have hidden capacities. So we have to understand this word capacity. And every time we do risk assessments in communities, we have to also understand what the capacity is within the community, what resources they have, what knowledge they have. Okay. So I'll just give an example from a developed country. And this is a mudslide in the state of Washington in the United States, 2014. And as you can see that this was the situation before the mudslide. And this is what happened. So the whole area just collapsed, as you can see in the photograph. And what had happened is that this hazard was also a compound of the natural hazard, which was, of course, excessive rain and the terrain, but also it was a man-made thing because they knew that they were logging too much timber from these forests. So this forest was getting denuded and losing its vegetation cover, which could actually prevent the runoff. And there were warnings also. In 2004, there was a study that they found that it was getting excessively denuded. They wanted to restrict it, but it still went on logging. So you see, these kind of things compound, and even in a developed country like the USA, because of man-made factors, people experience disasters. So this is another way of conceptualizing vulnerability. It's a multidimensional process, and there are all these different factors. And then I will go into these factors: social, economic, political, physical, environmental. I will go into all those, but just to look at a very simple equation. Remember, the first one I said the relationship was between hazard and capacity and risk. So here we understand vulnerability in terms of these three elements. Exposure. Exposure is where you are. If you're living right on the coast, you are exposed to cyclones, for example, or tsunamis. Sensitivity. If you are poor, if you are disabled, if you're elderly, if you are a child, then you're more sensitive to the impacts of hazards. And then the adaptive capacity, which balances it. Remember, we've talked about capacity. And capacity is not only something which is static. It adapts over time through a process of learning, iterative learning through experience, and knowledge gathers and gains, and the gain from lessons learned from previous disasters, previous experiences, the experience of others. So adaptive capacity it's a dynamic way of looking at the concept of capacity. So what are the vulnerable conditions? And we can start looking at things like the economic side of things. Yes, fragile livelihoods. They may not have any kind of savings or credit facilities. There's no insurance. And as you know, in many so-called countries of the global south or developing countries, there's no insurance, and people actually have to suffer any kind of disaster, including the impact of COVID, for example. There's no actual support from the institution. And a large bulk of the people also work in the informal sector. They're doing small livelihoods, selling things on the street, running their own businesses, and they are not insured. The downside of it is that the government also cannot get any taxation from them. Every person on the street who's selling things in Jakarta, for example, if they give $1 per month, there might be 5 million of them. You get $5 million. as a tax base. So, but that tax base is not there. And that tax base could actually be a way of providing insurance. Now, there are very innovative schemes in some developing countries where they're thinking of, supporting people who are most vulnerable, people who are farmers who may lose their crops because of the impacts of hazard. So, but it is still a weak area. Then the natural side of it is that people depend on natural resources, common property resources, timber, fruits, vegetables, which come from nature. And now what really happens is that if you over depend on natural resources, these common property resources, two things can happen. One is the resource base gets depleted, it diminishes, the supply becomes smaller. And the second one is that certain interest groups, they kind of come and capture these resources and they start making, money. So this is what it is. Can you hold on for 1 minute, please? Sorry, I had to get the dog. He wanted to come in and play with me. Okay, so natural, then we look at constructed. Constructed is the most obvious one. Buildings get damaged, roads get destroyed, bridges fall. And if they are not built properly or, they are not located in rightly. So I will have to go a bit faster. So I'll look at individual and then the social side of things. So now about categorizing vulnerability, I give you an overview of what the vulnerable conditions were: economic, natural, constructed, individual, social, and then we come to the different kinds of vulnerability. So one is the physical one, which is quite obvious. And every time there's a disaster, you see all the buildings collapsing, and the media, of course, this is what they can show. But the social dimensions is harder to capture, but they are equally important, perhaps sometimes even more. Dimensions such as age, gender, poverty, all that, culture, attitudes, behavior, all those norms, values. So that is the other side. Economic, of course, and very often every time we have the discussions, people say, look, we don't have the money to do DRR. We are just kind of in a very, very difficult situation. So, and people can lose. And then there's the institutional side of things: poor governance, inadequate governance, lack of disaster risk reduction and management systems, and also accessibility in terms of getting access to information, knowledge, resources, all that. And then finally, we come to the environmental side of it. It's climate change issues, climate change adaptation, and then poor planning. Can you just give me a minute, please? I just want to get the dog in. He wants to come in. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so the environmental side of it. And so once we go to that, so you see the different kinds of, why do we categorize? So we can understand better how different parts of the physical environment behave, and the different kinds of hazard impacts and kind of behavior of different kinds of structures, and so on. So different reasons for it. And then we look at physical vulnerability. You see these examples. It's quite obvious. It's quite clear. And then we look at social vulnerability. It's just weak family ties, lack of leadership, and all that. So these are the different kinds. I will not go into each of them in great detail because and you will have the presentation to study them later. And the other side of social vulnerability is the attitudinal side, and motivational side. Very often communities, they need motivation. They need to be, they have the resources, they have the capacity, but they are not organized, they're not motivated. And they can have negative attitudes. They can have fatalism. Oh, it's all God's will. Whatever happens will happen. I can't help it. The feeling of passivity. I've got no power, the sense of powerlessness, hopelessness. And that kind of, it's a very strong problem. I remember I was once in Jakarta after the earthquake, and people were rebuilding houses in the same way that they'd built before the earthquake, even though they were given many guidelines by the University of Gajah Mada. Many volunteer students went and worked with them, but they were doing the same kind of thing. So I asked them that, why are you building like that? You lost your dear one, someone died. well, you're doing the same thing. And this is all God's will. If something happens, no one can save me. It's Allah who will save me. So you see, so that is the problem in many countries. That we need to get out of this passive attitude. Economic vulnerability, we all know what that is. It's a whole range of. So I will go through an institutional vulnerability. Firstly, I mentioned that if they don't have any systems, and many countries don't have it, including countries like Australia, we don't have a dedicated ministry for disasters. In some countries they do. In Sri Lanka has one, Bangladesh has one. Some countries have a dedicated, and I believe even in Indonesia, you probably have a bureau that deals directly with disasters. And this has happened because of the increasing impacts of disasters in many of these countries. And then environmental vulnerability. Of course, this is one of the biggest problems throughout the world, as we can see. Even rich and poor countries all are in the same game. That because of excessive utilization of natural resources, that we have made the environment vulnerable. And then, of course, how we behave, the climate change issue. Okay, so now we come to a very, very quick exercise, and this I will let you, the participants, how many are we here? Oh, 28, excellent. Okay, so what we will do is that you will have to choose any one of these. Now think of yourself as a policymaker, and you're only given some money, and you say that you have to address only one kind of vulnerability. Which will you give the most priority, the top priority, okay? So is it physical, social, institutional, economic, or environmental? So do that. What you will need to do is that you go to this website, Socrative.com, and then you click Login tab from the top right, and you click Student Login. And once you do that, then you have to enter the room name, which is my last name, Ahmed 5886. Okay, and then you can choose any answer. So I will actually start the quiz. I will bring it to this. Do you want this on the screen so you can remember those 5? And then I will start the quiz. Are you able to join? Can you see on the screen? I will see the result. Good. See, while you're seeing the result, E is environmental, okay? Only one answer. Are you able to join? Do you need the instructions again?
Yes, sir. Please show the instructions again, sir.
So go to Socrative.com and then click Login tab from top right. And then you click Student Login. And then you enter the room number, Ahmed 5886. And then you choose any one answer. Good. I think people are coming in. Okay. Oh. So you can log in. I'll go back to that one. So you can see which is A, B, C, D, and E. Any more? Good, good. Think of your own country. Think of Indonesia. Which one would you give the most priority? It's a big country, I understand that. But think of Surabaya then. I'll wait a couple of minutes to see if others do it. Yes, good. Have you been able to log in, others? One more, maybe 9. Okay, so I think we will end it here. Someone has chosen 2 answers, A and B. You can't choose 2, you have to choose only 1. But I can see that a lot of you have focused on B. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 Bs out of 8 answers. So 50% of you actually thought it was social. Very good. Environmental, only 1. Okay, this is interesting. The reason why I did this is that you see the values are so different. When I ran this in my class in Australia, many of them chose E, environmental, many of them, because they thought the environmental issue was just the most important one. But I think what you have seen in countries like Indonesia, the social factor is very important. I think even C, even D, I think is very important. Only 1 has chosen that. Okay, so that was just a very quick exercise for you to work on. I will stop this now. Chat, is there a question? Monica, my response to the sister on Australia would have a different response for Indonesia. Okay, sounds good. Okay, yeah, that's what I was saying also, that it'll vary according to the country. Because this is pitched mainly for Indonesian students, so that is why. But nevertheless, it just gives you an idea that it's very hard to decide. While you were doing it, I'm sure you encountered problems. Which one should it be? Which is the most important? Where do I place my money on? So it is not easy to understand which vulnerability should be focused on, because all of them are actually very important. Okay, so I won't give you my answer, of course. There are no quick questions. We'll have to move faster. So now we'll come to power. Okay, and now we'll talk about how disasters are understood by an analysis of power. Firstly, is these market-based policies, the neoliberal free market kind of approach that have kind of over the long term, and in some countries in a very short term, they have just destroyed people's livelihoods, health, and security, and made them more vulnerable. They've, whittled away at their resilience, and this actually forces people to live in areas, because the most valuable land is captured with the rich and wealthy, and the poor go to the hazardous and marginal areas. And and you look at this photograph. I've taken this photograph from Bangladesh, from where I come, in one of the cities. And you can see that all these people are living by the railway track. And you can see this just almost, this is supposed to be the easement. No one is supposed to build in it, because that is the easement for the railway. But people having no access to land, this is where they start living, and this is how they live. So you can see the kind of, market-based approach, which kind of makes people unequal and vulnerable. And you look at this whole notion of distribution power, and power, of course, comes with wealth as well. And so once that is, not distributed properly, then people are not able to deal with hazards. And then you see that if you look at some statistics, you see that more people die from disasters in low and middle income, so-called developing countries. And within these countries, the most affected people are the urban poor and people in rural areas, and people who are who live subsistence-based livelihoods. So this actually is quite an interesting one. You see that some of the figures. Now you see that this is total number of deaths from disaster 2020, and you see total estimated damages from so-called natural disasters. So you see that Haiti tops the list in terms, and Haiti is one of the poorest countries in the world, and the maximum number of people died. Whereas when you're looking at estimated economic damage, then you see that top of the list is the United States, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, if not the wealthiest. So you see that then followed by China, which is also a very wealthy country now, and Japan, you see. And here, these countries are not even on the list, number of people who died. And you see countries like Indonesia, very, very large number of people who died. And this was particularly because of the Indian Ocean tsunami as well. So you see the difference, very stark. And the other reason why this happened is there a question? No? Okay, so the thing is that this happens because also in most of these so-called developed or countries in the global north, they have more assets, more high-value assets. So if there's a disaster, then the high-value asset is lost. Whereas in many of these countries, the asset value isn't very high. They are very simple structures, poorly built structures. So basically people die, but the economic damage is less. So there are two sides to it also. And so what are the underlying factors that create risk for people? Landlessness, lack of tenure security, which is a very important one, particularly for the urban poor. And we've talked about being pushed to urban fringes, building codes. That's the other problem. Many of them don't have any building codes, or there's no enforcement. And market access, gender, age, ethnic diversity, all that. And then finally, power asymmetries, which I kept on talking about, that power is actually consolidated and concentrated in certain groups in society. So Weber, he's a writer who talked in 2004, and he gave this idea about power, and he talked about different forms of power. One is coercion, that you force people to do things by force, and the other one is authority. And authority gives you a sense of legitimacy, and this can be traditional authority. In certain countries, they may have village chiefs or charisma. In many countries, that authority is because of charisma, who is a beautiful film star, and that is why he is, charismatic, and or law or rationality, and which is the kind of system that works in so-called developed countries, is this notion of rationality and law. And of course, it can be misused. It can be misused or it could be used for reducing disaster. It depends on how you're applying power. And I won't go into these examples. This is an example from the colonial past in Zambia. They had the slash and burn agriculture before, and now they have started going into the structural adjustment policies. And because of the structural adjustment policies, they started doing monoculture. In many countries, in Indonesia, you have the same issue with monoculture, the palm oil production. In Kalimantan, for example, it's just monoculture, and that destroys the environment, but it is export oriented. And this is quite clear, wealth, economic power, and disasters. You can see this photograph from Mexico City. On one side, there's this gated community, and just across the wall, you see the low-income settlements and the informal settlements. And what has happened is that because of this growth of prosperity, it has led to economic development, but not everyone benefits from this economic development. This is more glaringly evident from some of the bigger countries in Asia, such as China and India, that you see that there's massive economic growth, but you see large segments of the population who are like an underclass, really. So I will have to go a bit fast. I think, Fitri, I'm going a bit slow. Am I not? I've got about 5 minutes. So I will not go into these in great detail. What I want to do is that I just want to show you ways of interpreting power. So first is the power over, that is to affect actions, and this is basically a top-down approach. And then the power to is to be patronizing, is to say, okay, we'll help you do things. And then power with, it's much more like working together as collective and building up alliances. And then power within, it's like when people have the power, they're empowered in that sense. And these are all related to vulnerability, of course, and capacity. So you look at Gavinder's cube, and Gavinder's cube it talks about the different places, spaces, and power. The spaces are claimed, invited, and closed. The closed spaces are what happens in the big United Nations offices or government bureaus. Invited is when the UN would invite the civil society actors to participate, and claimed is through advocacy and through lobbying that people actually want certain rights to be realized. And so you see that they can be a combination with different parts of the cube. You could have a hidden, invited, and a national area. So this is the way you can conceptualize how the power cube manifests itself in terms of these three different elements. So these are the different spaces where this power cube plays out. No, I won't go into it. I won't take a break. And then you come to this issue of religion, culture, and behavioral factors. And basically what really happens in the so-called Western paradigm, it is kind of people against nature. And nature is seen as something that can be controlled through science. And whereas with indigenous cultures, and even in indigenous cultures within Australia, they are very closely linked to nature, and they accept nature is part of life. It is, as is how they live. And in some religious thinking, it is also thought of as, God's punishment. And this has happened even in the case of COVID. They think that, we have not led the right path, and that is why we are being punished by God. So this is a kind of fatalism. And we've talked about fatalism earlier. And then also, though, the religious bodies, they can fulfill a certain gap. They can provide support. And every time there's a disaster, people can take shelter in religious buildings, which are often strongly built. The Grand Mosque in Aceh in Indonesia, as you know, survived the tsunami because it was really well built. And because it was well built, it also gave protection to people. Just to show you some examples, this is the 2004 tsunami in Thailand, and you can see some of these Buddhist temples in Phuket, which was severely affected by the tsunami. And these temples survived because they were well built, and a lot of people took shelter here, and they were supported for a long time till recovery could be achieved. So there is that role. And then you look at the earthquake, Jakarta earthquake in Indonesia, and I've talked a little bit about it. And as you can see, that after that, there were all these guidelines and very beautifully produced booklets, which showed you how to build. So how to build earthquake resistant structures. You can see some of these houses were being built. They introduced these lateral ties, and they had the corner columns so that there's a frame to hold it together, and all kinds of ways to make it earthquake proof. But you see, these people, they were given about $1,500 to build the house, and from the government. And many of them actually use that money to buy colorful tiles and decorate the house, and they spend the money, and they couldn't complete the house because they had to do all this also, as you can see. So that's a cultural factor. And yeah, you can see the photograph of the community. I was there at that time, just after the earthquake, talking to them. And here was the discussion that I had about the fatalism, that, look, why are you rebuilding the same way? Aren't you worried? But they said, no, it's God's will. Oops. And this vulnerability is also compounded by things like this. This is also in Yogyakarta. this organization, they came in and they built these igloos. These igloos are, or igloo-like structures, really, because they are more resistant to earthquakes, because the shape is like that, and that is why we are building this. And they go and they build all of these. This photograph on the side, this was built in Sri Lanka as well. So, and now these countries, they don't have a culture of building houses like this. This is the kind of house that they build on the right-hand bottom side. And so, because it's a rainy climate, this can work in a hot, dry climate, but not in a rainy, monsoonal climate like Indonesia or Sri Lanka. So what these people did was they started adding these awnings to protect themselves from the rain, which is going in. As you can see, extensive changes. So there's a cultural factor to it also. And at the end, it makes people vulnerable, even more vulnerable than they were before with this kind of experimentation. This is another one I wanted to talk to you a little bit about in Indonesia after the tsunami. Now, what the government had done after the tsunami is that they said the house has to be a 36 square meter house, a 6 by 6 meter. So this was the original house, okay? So 6 meter by 6 meter. So what they did was that people don't live like that. They live in very large extended families. So as you can see in this photograph, two brothers, they got two different houses of that size and they joined them. And over time, it became one big house. And so you see in this photograph that these are the extensions that people made to these houses because that size was not suitable for them. There are many other things also. There was a cultural factor because they just gave them a single bathroom, which is not appropriate, because what they do is that in the bathroom, they have two water tanks. One is the clean water tank for bathing, and the other is for ablution. It is in the toilet, so which is the, not so clean water tank. So the culture was not understood. And even by the Indonesian authorities, they wanted to follow a kind of westernized template. And you can see some of these houses. This is the original house, and this is the extension that they built after it. It's huge. So we have written quite a bit on it. We actually documented the number of houses that were transformed over time by their owners. Cultural factors I am running out of time. I will go faster. In Vietnam, when we did that and we said, like, look, this was a post-cyclone recovery program. We were having a workshop with many of the locals. And what we said is that you have to build a house which faces the wind with the shape of the roof, the gable facing the roof. But this is not what they do. They want a very long roof which spans in that direction. And that kind of lifts off the roof. But they said, no, this looks like a coffin. We don't like it. So, yeah. I won't go into aid provision, the necessity of good aid. What I will actually give you is that this is the IFRC and NGO core principles and code of conduct. And this needs to be upheld every time there is a disaster in terms of aid provision. So finally, I'm coming to an end. So what we need to do, the main message which I was trying to say is that give special attention to the local experience, local values, local feelings, very important. And empathy is this important factor. And because once we don't understand these, then we cannot actually do disaster risk reduction programs, because people's perception and their interpretation of risk and vulnerability is interlinked with their experience and their values. And also the notion of knowledge and information. I've talked about accessibility. Because they are unevenly distributed, there's often not enough trust, and the trust is essential. And then the other thing is the NGOs and CBOs, community-based organizations and non-government organizations, they're closer to people and communities, and they offer an advantage, even though they have certain limitations. I'm not talking about the big international NGOs, not like Oxfam, World Vision, and CARE and all that, but I'm talking about the national NGOs, which work at the grassroots. And many governments have started building up partnerships with these organizations. And this helps them to be more inclusive and if may make their decision-making public policy for disaster risk reduction more effective. So I think that's about it from me. I just want to show you a very quick video clip. Do I have time, Fitri?
Yes, Prof.
Okay.
Please.
Thank you.
জানতাম না বন্যা আসলে কি করতে হয় আমার খুব ভয় ছিল তখন
মনে করেন যে বাড়ির ভিতরে এতটুকু করে পানি হয়েছিল ঘরের ভিতরে এইখানে করে পানি হয়েছিল মনে করেন যে আগে মনে করেন যে বন্যা বেশি হয়েছে চোখের উপরে বাচ্চা নিয়ে চালের উপরে উঠছি
চৌকি ছিল চৌকির উপর চৌকি রাখতাম তার উপরে আমরা ছেলেটাকে নিয়ে থাকতাম এবং চতুর্পাশ দিয়ে সাপ কলকল করে যেত
তাতে মনে করে এই বাচ্চাটা পানিতে পড়ে গেছিল পড়ে যাওয়ার পর আর একবারে মরে পানিতে নিখায় পেটটা ফুলে আর মরার অবস্থা হয়েছিল শরীর খুবই অসুস্থের মধ্যে আছে বাচ্চা কলের মুখ তলা গেছে গা কিসের পানি খামো মনে করেন যে মেলা কিছু ডায়রি হয়েছে জ্বর আসছে কলের গুড়া পাকা করি এখন মনে করেন যে ট্রেডিং পার পরে মনে করেন যে শিখছি আগে জানি নাই মনে করেন যে আগে অনেক বিপদে আছে স্কেচ ভাইয়েরা মনে করেন যে আমরা সহযোগিতা করাতে ট্রেডিং করাতে সুমতি করাতে আমরা এখন মেলাখানি আগে আগেছি আলোচনা করে আমরা আগে সচেতন না থাকি নাহলে দুর্যোগে আমাদের কোনো ক্ষয়ক্ষতি না করতে পারি
হচ্ছে বেশি ঝুঁকিপূর্ণ মানে নদী এলাকা নদী এলাকা মানে নদীর সাইডে ভাঙ্গা এলাকা এগুলো বেশি
ঝড় তুফানে হতে ঘরটা ক্ষতি হয়ে যেতে পারে খুঁটিটা লাগাইতেছে শক্ত করার জন্য মাটি কেটে উঁচা করা
আমার বাড়ি এখন উঁচা হয়েছে আমার বাড়িতে এখন বন্যা আসে না আর জল উঠার ভয় নাই ভাঙার ভয় নাই
বন্যার টাইমে অসুবিধা হলো পাক শাকের অসুবিধা হলো শুকনা চুলা শুকনা খড়ি মাছা উঁচা করি মনে করেন যে ওই যে পাট রাখছি তারপরে মনে করেন শুকনো খাবার ঘরে রাখছি ট্রেনিং করার পরে মনে করেন যে দুর্যোগ আসার ভয়ে মনে করেন যে আমরা একটা শিখছি
দুর্যোগের ট্রেনিং পাওয়ার পর আমরা এখন বন্যা আসার আগেই আর গর্ভবতী মহিলা যদি বৃদ্ধ মানুষ থাকে এবং ছোট বাচ্চা থাকে বন্যা আসার আগে আমরা এগুলো নিরাপদের স্থানে পাঠিয়ে দিই
দুর্যোগ সাজাওয়ার পরে পানি নামে গেল মাটি ধার পড়লেও গর্দগাতা বাড়া গেল তো ওই জায়গায় মাটি দেওয়া হয় লেফা পোছা করা হয় ডায়রিয়া হলে গেলে খাবার স্যালাইন তৈরি করা হয় মিঠাই দিয়া লবণ দিয়া
দুর্যোগে আসার আগে কি করতে হবে দুর্যোগে চলাকালীন কি করতে হবে এবং দুর্যোগ যাওয়ার পরে কি করতে হবে এই জিনিসগুলো আমাদের শিখেছি
আমার বন্যার সমস্যা নাই আগে মনে করেন তো ওগুলো বন্যার সমস্যা হয়েছে বাচ্চা কাচ্চার ক্ষতি হয়েছে আমাদের ক্ষতি হয়েছে সংসারে এখন আর এই সমস্যাটা আমাদের ধন্যবাদ
Right. I just want to give you a little flavor of what can be done in even in some of the poorest and most vulnerable communities with just a little bit of building capacity. So it's just a promotional video, I know, but I think it just demonstrates the efforts. So I'll leave you with some questions. You can study these questions on your own, look at relationship in power dynamics, and you have the presentation, and you can also look at the study of culture and how it can help us to understand vulnerability and deal with it. So I will stop here. We can have a little discussion, questions if you want.
Thank you, Professor Ifte, for the valuable public lecture. And now we continue with Q&A session, and the session will lead by Dr. Arif Hargono. Please, Prof.
Okay. Thank you to Fitri. Yeah, first of all, I would to say thank you to Prof. Ite for your comprehensive presentation about the vulnerability and then the impact to the disaster. Now we continue to enter with the next session about the discussion. So please, for the participant, if you have the question, you can raise hand and then maybe you can explain in Bahasa or in English, and we will help you to translate in English.
Can I ask questions?
Ask a question about the disaster management in Indonesia, especially in something like disaster that caused by the human. For example, in something like mountains, that because there are so many illegal logging and then so many of the opening of the area because of the building of housings, there are so many of management that's still not developing well. And then what's that? So many projects in Indonesia, especially in making housing and property, that caused by some of the investors that can pass the law of environments so that the disaster can be inevitable. So what do you think about that, sirs?
Okay, I see what you're saying. Look, this is a problem not only in Indonesia, even in Australia, throughout the world. I think this expansion of settlements into natural areas in Australia, if I can give an example, that we have bushfires, right? And bushfires usually happen in forested areas. But now there are more and more settlements which are going into these areas. And because of that, they are creating this vulnerability. And it's the same with Indonesia, that if you're going to expand in areas which are at high risk, then you're placing yourself at risk. And this is something which the policymakers need to understand. And very often in many countries, and I can imagine Indonesia, the urban planning sector doesn't work with the disaster sector. Okay, the disaster risk reduction and management, what they end up in doing is only providing relief after disasters and response oriented. But this risk management through development, land use planning, all that is not addressed by them. This is done by different ministries. And that is why we talk about mainstreaming. The term is mainstreaming, is that you have to mainstream disaster risk reduction into all sectors, education, health, real estate, whatever you want to talk about. But unless we have the mainstreaming approach, we cannot actually prevent people doing different things. You may have a very good disaster risk reduction system, but it is not mainstream. So what you end up in doing is only provide support after a disaster. And this happens even in countries like Australia, very good at emergency relief, emergency management. But the long-term resilience that needs to come in by preventing and creating risk. And creating, what you're talking about is creation of new risks. And one of the main elements within the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, as you know, is about not to create new risks. If we create new risks, as it is, we already have existing risks. So yeah, I can't answer your question how to go about doing it, except that one way to do it is to mainstream and to give more power to the authorities that deal with disaster risk reduction, that they can actually go and work together with other stakeholders in other ministries.
As well as bureaucratic influence is really important to combat the disaster, especially related to the policymaker.
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Pak Ahmad, mute. Please.
No, he is muted.
So
He's muted.
you mean that policymakers as well as the... I mean that political connection, and also with the bureaucratic influence is really important in combating the policymaker rights.
Yes, definitely.
To avoid something like disasters.
Yeah. And that is when you go back to that power cube and you see how they're operating. If they're operating behind closed spaces and the agenda is hidden, then obviously it's a matter of power at the end. And power is also linked with wealth, and people benefit from keeping the power consolidated. And that needs to be challenged. And the challenge is being done often by the civil society actors, human rights organizations. People understand that and because what really happens, these policies, they actually affect the people who are the poorest and the most vulnerable. And in many countries like Indonesia, that is the majority of the population. So unless we challenge those policies which consolidate power and wealth into certain areas and damage the environment for personal profit, unless we start challenging those through advocacy groups, lobbying, we cannot address this issue. Okay, any more questions? I can see there's some in the chat box. I'm just going into that. No.
No, that's not about the question.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe any other question from the participant? Dapat disampaikan dalam bahasa Indonesia. Monggo kami persilahkan jika ada pertanyaan dari para peserta. Dalam bahasa Indonesia juga nggak apa-apa.
You can translate for me then yes. When they ask in Bahasa. No?
Ada pertanyaan? Well, we with the question from the participant, Prof. Ifte, regarding to your question about the vulnerability, the highest priority. You said that for Indonesia, you're supposed to be the answer institutional and economic. What do you think about that, Prof. Ifte?
Yeah, I think you will have to prioritize in your own context. I think the social factor is important, but the economic factor is very important, economic vulnerability. And increasingly, with more and more inequality happening, with more development happening in Indonesia, it's now moving very fast. And a lot of people are being left behind. And these are the people who are most vulnerable. They are living in rural areas or in urban informal settlements. So that is the area I think we need to focus in. In more developed countries, I think there's a lot of damage happening to the environment. All of them are important, but I think they need to focus a bit more on the environmental aspects of vulnerability.
And how about the institutional? Because they have the
yes.
competence and they provide the rule, authority has the rule to influence the stakeholder to supposed to have the priority in the disaster management.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. They're all interlinked. I think that is also very, very important, particularly the question which the other gentleman asked, Ahmed. It relates to that. Unless there's institutional capacity for mainstreaming DRR, disaster reduction, if they don't have that capacity, then they can't do it. If they don't have the systems in place, if they don't have the authority, and that is the kind of power we want, that power which empowers other people to be able to be, active and address their own disaster risk. So yes, the institutional aspect is very, very important.
Yeah.
It is often misunderstood. The institutional aspect is concentrated, and they have the power and they order people to do things. Let me give you an example. Let's talk about building codes. Okay, now a building code is a question of, it's the institutional side. You have to build properly. You have to have disaster resilient features and all that. And it is there in the building codes. But to enforce it is the problem. It's very hard to implement it, and a lot of corruption also happens in this area. And so that is where the problem is. That is where the institutional capacity needs to come in, that they have to have the capacity not only to have the codes and to interpret them, but also to implement and enforce them and get people to be compliant. Like in countries like Australia, they are still non-compliance, even though by and large, I think 90% of the people are compliant to building codes, but there's still people building informally. I just heard the other day of someone who was talking about people who actually built in the bush, near bushfire prone areas, and then they lost their house, but they built informally. They just went and built it themselves, a nice house, and they don't care about getting a permission, who's going to come and see me. But then when they lost the house in the fire, they could not get any money from the insurance or from the government because it was informal. Okay. So that is what it is. I think this informality is one of the main issues which the institutional side needs to deal with. It links to the social economic side also.
Yeah, all is very important. And most of these participants is student and academic. So what is the role of the, especially for the student and academic in the disaster management to give the impact for the solution for the especially in the RPM?
Yes, this is a very important question. There are two sides to it. One is we need to do research as academics. It is part of our job. And in certain countries, I mean, yesterday I had my own meeting. We call it the PRD, is Progress Review and Development. So I had to see how much percentage of my time I give for research. So I say, like, I've got at least minimum 40% of my time is for research. And that research, the second part is, what is the nature of the research? If I'm doing work which only some of my peers read, it has got no impact. It has to have impact on the ground. It is research which is about vulnerability. It is about people, how to reduce their risk, and how that research is disseminated to the people who need it more. So that is what we can do, is to ensure that our research reaches people. It's not only publication in journals, but also to have these research results translated into action in simple terms so that people can understand it, to action research projects. So that's one side of it. The other one, for students, I think there's a very strong role that they can do in volunteering, working with communities, some of the knowledge that they're gaining from the university, because they are the intermediary. You or me, we would have it harder to access the communities than them, because they are closer to the communities. And countries in Indonesia, for example, in Jakarta, I know after the earthquake, Jakarta Earthquake in 2006, many student volunteers from Gajah Mada University went and worked with the communities, and they learned the stuff from their teachers, that how to make stronger houses, how to make safer houses. They got the booklets drawn, published with diagrams, and then they went and explained to the people and helped them. So I think they have a very strong role to work as the interface with the community.
Okay. Thank you for the answer, Prof. Baik, Bapak Ibu, apakah masih ada yang ditanyakan? Kami persilahkan. Dari para mahasiswa.
They are shy, a bit quiet today.
Ya, bagaimana Bapak Ibu? Yeah, I think you already give the comprehensive presentation, Prof. Ifte, and you have already give some message in the last your presentation about especially to the participant that we have to consider all of the components from the institution, economic and social, and all of the components to improve and to give the impact for the disaster management. And I think, is it enough, Bu Fitri, or there is some
I think it is enough.
Message from the
it's enough from Dr. Arif. But before that, Prof. Ifta, I would like to propose an agenda to Prof. Ifta. You see, our international unit will hold a webinar about adaptive social protection, and one of the speakers in that webinar is Adaptive Social Protection Program Manager from UNICEF. So if you okay, I would like to invite you to be one of the speakers in that event. It will be held on June 2nd. June 2nd.
Yeah, that's fine. There's enough time, so I can build it into my schedule. Please send me the information.
Yes, I will send you the invitation later, just like usual. Yes.
That is fine. That is not a problem. And also, I will follow up on the discussion with Dr. Arif.
Yes.
Please, you can take my email from Fitri, and then we could have a little communication. You can see how we can build up the collaboration between our universities.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we come to the last session of public lecture. Once again, thank you very much for Professor Ifte for valuable lecture. And indeed, it is our honor to have you as our guest professor. And before I close the session, I would like to thank you all the participants, the students, for your attention and participation in today's public lecture. Of course, we hope that in upcoming semester or upcoming agenda in June 2nd, yes, Professor, we will have Professor Ifte again delivering another public lecture. So see you in the upcoming agenda, everyone. Thank you and stay safe and have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you. Terima kasih. Terima kasih.
Thank you.